So it's set to be a very interesting day. And to kick us off, we have Elaine Gramley. She has she didn't really want me to talk about this, but she's got a brand new book, which is available on our bookstall over there. It's called A Diet of Austerity, so you should definitely go check that out after her talk. But Elaine, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, I'm going to be talking about the first revolutions, which the title defines as the English, American and French revolutions. I'm going to be touching on why that's not quite right. But basically we're focusing on these three revolutions because these are the bourgeois revolutions. This is when the bourgeoisie get control of the state and run it for their benefit, as opposed to under feudalism it's run for the benefit of the aristocracy, or under a proletarian revolution, which is obviously what we all want to happen, where the state will be run for the benefit of ordinary people. So first slide, please. So this is, I'm not going to read out the whole thing, don't worry, but this is Marx in the Communist Manifesto on the bourgeois revolution. What I want to point out about this is it's very clear that the bourgeoisie are a revolutionary class. These are genuine revolutions. They do mean a shift in the fundamental way that societies run, the fundamental relations of production. And this is the completion, if you like, of the shift from feudalism to capitalism. And I'm stressing that because if you talk to most mainstream historians, actually that's a view that's been challenged. Most historians really will argue against one or both of those bits of what Marx said about the bourgeois revolution. So part of what I'm going to be doing today is explaining why Marx was right and mainstream bourgeois historians are wrong. So I'm just going to start off sketching some very sketchily just some of the historical background, just so if you're not sure who Robespierre is or what Oliver Cromwell did, I'm just going to go over that very briefly. So next slide. So start with the English Civil War. As the perspicacious among you will have noticed, this was not taken in the 17th century. These are modern reenactors dressed up as the New Model Army, and they do actually call themselves Oliver's Army, which I thought was neat, so hence the picture. So the English Civil War is between King Charles I and his supporters on the one side, so they're the royalists, and the parliamentarians on the other. So the royalists are the bulk of the aristocracy. There are some aristocrats on the parliament side, but much more it's the gentry and what's called the middling sort. So kind of the middle class, and some of the poorest people. Not everyone. There's been sort of estimates that actually only sort of 50% of people were really involved in the Civil War, but some of the poorest people are on the parliament side. It started in January 1642, when Charles was expected basically to seize power from Parliament. He went to Parliament to arrest 5 of the leaders of the Parliament side, and found that the birds had flown. They'd gone from Westminster to London, to the city. He tried to pursue them to the city, and he was driven out of the city actually by the London mob, by kind of women throwing pots and pans at him, and the apprentices and things like that. So that's the start of the war. There's kind of a second civil war, which is in the beginning of the 1650s, which I'm not really going to talk about. But the first civil war basically ends when Charles is executed in January 1649. And then Oliver Cromwell, who'd emerged on the Parliament side during the course of the war, then ruled as Lord Protector until he died. And after he died in 1660, a faction in Parliament invited Charles I's son back to be king as Charles II. So that's kind of the very, very basic what happened. Next slide. So then the American Revolution, this is a century later, we're now in the 18th century. The basic grievance with the American Revolution started off as taxation, because starting in the 1760s, the English state, George III, made a decision that actually he wanted to be able to lower the tax burden on the English aristocracy and instead shift that burden to the colonies, because actually that would get him support at home, and who cares about colonials, they don't matter. So the English state started levying many more taxes on the American colonists than they had done, including something called the stamp tax, which was horrendously unpopular, because you had to get an official government stamp on all sorts of things, and you had to pay for that. So that was really hated. And it became not just about it was hurting people in their pockets, it became a realisation that, well, this is the definition of taxation without representation. That they're being taxed by the state, but they actually have no say. They don't control who runs that state. They don't have a vote. They're not choosing the king or choosing the parliament. They're just having these taxes imposed on them. So that was kind of where that came from. And the Boston Tea Party, which you may have heard of as being this famous event when the colonists chucked the tea into Boston Harbour, that was because by then, in 1773, tea was one of the last things where these unfair taxes were being levied on. So it was actually quite, it sounds kind of silly to us now, but it was actually a really powerful statement of, no, we're not going to put up with taxation without representation anymore. And again, because it became about much more than that, it actually became about taking power, and actually from really the lower level. So you have, for example, in Pennsylvania, where people were sort of organising congresses to oppose the taxation. And the Congress in Pennsylvania didn't want to do that, so they had an alternative, basically an alternative form of government that came out of the protest against taxes. So it became much, much more wide-ranging than just taxation. And in the end, in 1783, the British withdrew, and you had American independence. Next slide, please. So, and the next revolution I'm going to talk about is the French Revolution, which is almost contemporaneous with the American Revolution, and is really the hardest to summarise. So excuse me for all the detail that I'm going to leave out in this very brief survey. So it starts in 1789, when the King of France calls what's called an Estates General. So French society is organised in 3 estates. So you have the first estate, which is the clergy, the second estate, which is the nobility, and the third estate, which is everybody else. So an Estates General is a gathering of representatives from the 3 estates. So it's kind of like a parliament in a way, but it doesn't happen regularly, it just happens when the king wants to call it. And the only reason really why the king ever wants to call it is because he wants to raise taxes, and that was the case in 1789. And what the third estate is supposed to do is troop along and say, yep, that's fine, we'll pay some more taxes, no problem there at all. And in 1789, they said, no, sod off, we want a new constitution. So the king called for troops to disperse the third estate, the representatives of the third estate. They refused to be dispersed, and then there was a rising in Paris, which stormed the Bastille and took the Bastille being the royal prison, so it's a massive symbol of royal authority. So then basically you have, very, very broadly, you have basically 2 years of a kind of a moderate regime under a guy called Lafayette. So the king was still the king, but he didn't have absolute control anymore. It's in a sense, it's an attempt at kind of a constitutional monarchy. So you have, you know, a reforming regime, but they haven't actually got rid of the monarchy or anything like that. But the problem is that that's not a stable formation. On the one side, you have counter-revolutionaries who actually want to get rid of that moderate regime and bring the king back in kind of all his pomp, including people that the king kept on plotting with because he was a bit dim. And you also have, obviously, the much more radical forces that have been stirred up as part of the revolution who actually think, well, you know, we don't really want this either. We want to go further than this. So then after about 2 years, you have a much more revolutionary uprising, actually in response to an attempt at counter-revolution, where a group called the Jacobins, which comes out of a debate, it's a debating club in Paris where people get together to talk about politics, and that's their name. So that becomes kind of the name for a whole faction in the French Revolution. They take power and they abolish the monarchy. So that's in 1792. And then in January 1793, the king is executed because they realise you keep having these counter-revolutionary attempts, actually you can't carry on having this guy being this figurehead for everyone who wants to restore the monarchy, going, oh yeah, I'm really happy to be restored. So you have to get rid of the guy, so they execute him. And then after that, this is when you have, you know, kind of the popular image of the French Revolution being all about executing aristocrats. That's 1793, and that's because they're always under threat of counter-revolution. So in 1794, that regime is overthrown. That's when Robespierre, who's one of the Jacobin leaders, is executed. And at that point, then that's starting to roll back the revolution. So the Jacobin regime, they abolished the property qualification. You had every man could vote. It didn't matter how much you owned or anything. You were a man, you had the vote. Men, but you know, take what you can get. But after the Jacobins are overthrown, they immediately reimpose a property qualification. So it's saying, okay, the poorest people can't vote, it's only for people of a certain level. So this is only really if you're bourgeois. In 1795, in response to a royalist uprising, they then put power in the hands of only 5 people. It's called the Directory. In 1799, Napoleon, who'd risen to prominence as being a useful guy, an officer, a very good general, who could resist the sort of counter-revolutionary pressures, staged the coup. So he then became emperor, and he was crowned, in fact, by the Pope as emperor in 1804. And then when he's defeated by the Allied powers in 1814 and then again in 1815, they then reinstate the monarchy. So you have again a Bourbon on the throne of France. So that's kind of very briefly what happened. What I'm now going to do is just draw out, I think, some general points about what I think everyone should know about bourgeois revolutions. So the first one is, as I said, it's really Marx's point that they're not just political events. I've described the political events, but it's not just about one faction taking power for the other, or someone didn't like an individual monarch or anything like that. This is a fundamental change in the way society is organised, and that's what's driving them. So basically, what we have to recognise is what the bourgeois revolutions show us is that the interests of the nobility and the interests of the bourgeoisie are fundamentally in conflict. That's the next slide. As you can see, they're not compatible. It's about castles versus factories. So if you think about it, if you're a feudal aristocrat, the way that you get money, the way that you exploit the lower classes to defend your position, to get your resources, is by having people on land that you own working, working for you, giving you stuff, working on your own land. If you're a member of the bourgeoisie and you want to get rich, actually what you need to do is get those people to work in your factory so that you can exploit them, so you can get surplus value for their labour. You can't actually run a society for very long when you have these two things, because they're incompatible. You've only got the same one pool of people to exploit in two completely different ways. So the interests of the bourgeoisie and the interests of the aristocracy actually are at odds. You can't run a state that serves both of these for very long. And in fact, you see this because in the centuries before the bourgeois revolutions, there's various regimes that try and marry these two. So in France, Henry IV, who is remembered, he's the king at the beginning of the 17th century, and he's remembered by many people as kind of a great sort of monarch who brought everyone together, and it's a new sort of flowering for France and so on, until he's murdered, but never mind. But he tried to have, on the one hand, a kind of an absolutist regime that appealed to the nobility, but also something that looked at sort of mercantile capital, at making sure the merchants were happy and so on. So he was trying to run a state that served the interests of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, because he hadn't read his Marx and he didn't know that you couldn't do that. And the fact that he ended up being murdered is possibly an indication of how this isn't very stable. You can't actually do this for a very long time. And beyond those structural things, there are also kind of things that are different in different states that also pit the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie against each other. So in France, I've said that there are three estates. So the second estate is the nobility, the third estate is everybody else, including the bourgeoisie. What I didn't say at that point is that the second estate have all the privilege. They're the people who are at court, they're the people who get lands from the king, they're the people who have the opportunity to be officers in the army, for example, because you can only be an officer in the army if you are a member of the second estate. And only the third estate pays taxes. So the nobility don't pay tax. The nobility raise their own tax from the peasants. Peasants have to pay seigneurial tax, which is to their local lord. But the actual tax burden, where the king gets his money, is all from the third estate. So basically, that's actually quite a lot from the peasantry. I'll talk about that a bit later. But that's actually quite a lot, obviously, from the rising bourgeois classes. So you have, in 17th century France, you have this very weird situation where you have lots of actually quite wealthy merchants, because France is a wealthy country, who have no or very little political power and pay all the taxes. And then you have lots of really very, very impoverished nobles who are really struggling to keep up appearances and run sort of shrinking bits of land, but they have all the status. So if you're a rising merchant in France, you really hate this. You're not going to carry on putting up with this for years and years and years. It's less the case in England, because in England it's much more fluid. In England you can, if you're particularly wealthy, if you get the ear of the king, you get the wool staple, so you have a monopoly on the wool trade and so on. You can kind of rise from the merchant class to the nobility. So there's not quite that division that there is in France. But there's still, if you look at actually the period before the English Civil War, there's considerable resentment of kind of noble privilege. There are these various figures who are friends of the king and who kind of get to swan around court and annoy everybody. And that is actually a genuine grievance in the run-up to Civil War, because actually the rising bourgeoisie really hates this kind of noble privilege. So, the other point I should make actually is the reason why this doesn't happen, these fundamental contradictions don't come out sooner is because in the Middle Ages, the way that this is kind of kept a lid on is that the bourgeoisie needs the monarchy to protect them from noble violence because they're not very powerful. So while they have to rely on the king to stop nobles from just deciding, right, I'm going to take over this town and sack it and steal everyone's goods, then they're not going to rise up and try and overthrow the monarchy. But as the bourgeoisie get more powerful, they start to think, well, actually, we can do things differently. We don't have to put up with this stuff. So that's why you start getting this happening in the early modern period. And the other point to make here is that from the little potted history I gave you of these three revolutions, is you might think, well, okay, but none of these actually end up with what looks like continuing bourgeois rule. After all, you end up with the Bourbon monarchy is restored in France. Charles II is the son of Charles I. He's king in England. So really, isn't this a story of failed revolutions? Well, what I want to argue is that although it looks like you have monarchies back in power, actually they're really fundamentally changed from what went before. So the next slide. So this is Charles II, and this is really just an excuse to share with you this little ditty, which I like very much. It says, we have a pretty witty king, and whose word no man relies on. He never said a foolish thing, and never did a wise one. So that's one of his contemporaries. And I think it's neat, really, but it does show you how Charles II is not an absolute monarch. He has to spend his whole reign balancing different forces. He's walking a really actually quite difficult tightrope, because he's not in absolute power, even though he's been invited back. This is under a very different sort of regime than his father was under. This is the start of the constitutional monarchy. So this is actually, England is from this point on a bourgeois state, even though it has a king. So the revolution, the English Civil War, was a fundamental change in English society. This is also the case actually in America. As what you had before the American War of Independence is you did have in some places, particularly in New York State, for example, you had the development of effectively noble families who had lots of land, and that's where they got their wealth from, and they were kind of building actually noble power. It seems really odd to think of somebody actually doing that from scratch in the 18th century, but that was what was happening. And that was stopped by the revolution. So that broke that possibility of having effectively American landed aristocrats. So again, it really is a fundamental change in society. And it's most clear actually in France. So next slide. So this is Stendhal, who's a French author, and he said, in 2,000 years of world history, so sharp a revolution in customs, ideas and beliefs has perhaps never happened before about the French Revolution. And he was absolutely right. It's an absolute fundamental change. Even though you eventually have the monarchy back, it's under completely different circumstances. Now, part of this is because, particularly in 1789, in the countryside, because mostly I talked about what happened in Paris, but all throughout France, actually, there's sort of peasants rise up and they sack the chateau. They don't necessarily kill all that many aristocrats, but they say they destroy their property. And what they do, actually, largely, is they destroy the records. So if you ever work on French history, it's really, really annoying, where you read in sort of historian after historian saying, oh yeah, there was this perfect set of records going back to the 10th century, and then in 1789 or 1793 they had a big bonfire in the town square and they burned them all. I work on 12th century southern France history and French history, and this happens in every town in the south of France. Like, why? But the thing is, it's a real point, because these were records that were being used to actually impose taxation, impose dues on the peasantry, and they're all destroyed. And that's part of what actually changes society fundamentally. That even when the monarchy's back, it has to work on different lines. And all these rules about which estate can do what, that's all gone. So again, even though you have a king in France, again, after 1815, it is not the same. This is now a bourgeois state. So it's a really fundamental change. And I think bourgeois historians that deny that are just because they're uncomfortable with the idea of revolution and the idea of revolutionary change in society, because it's really, really obvious that this is a fundamental change. So the next point I want to make is that although these are called bourgeois revolutions, and I've talked a bit about what problems the bourgeoisie had with the aristocracy, with the feudal system that still persisted. Really what is really important about these, what drives these forward, is actually revolution from below. That's what really matters in these revolutions. So the leaders of the revolutions, I've mentioned Robespierre, who's one of the leading Jacobins, he's a lawyer, and Oliver Cromwell, he's from a gentry family. So next slide. So this is Oliver Cromwell as a young man before the warts, and this is his house, which is in Ely, and it's very nice. You can go and visit it. It's quite It's quite a nice house, really. I mean, it's not a palace, it's not a castle, but you know, you can kind of see he doesn't come from a really poor family. He's from the gentry. And that's true, really, generally, of the leaders of these revolutions, that those are the sort of classes that they come from. And that is expressive of the fact that this is about the bourgeoisie coming out on top. But the thing is, actually, they're being driven by grievances of people who are much lower down in society than that. So, for example, in the English Civil War, Cromwell rises to prominence because he's very successful as a general. And he's very successful as a general because he's behind the New Model Army, which is partly because up until 1644, Parliament were losing. Because when you're up against aristocrats who have like horses and armour and training and so on, it's quite difficult. They have the upper hand. And then Oliver Cromwell finds the New Model Army, which is run on different lines from previous parliamentarian armies, because it's made up, basically, of people who want to be there. So again, they aren't necessarily all very poor people. In fact, they're mostly not, because what we're mostly talking about here is cavalry. So they're people who have horses, you know, which means you have a certain level of prosperity. But there again, they're people who are the middling sort. So they're not aristocrats. They're sort of partly sort of kind of, you know, just about gentry, that kind of level. And they're people who really believe in the ideals of Parliament, in the ideals of some sort of democracy, of overthrowing the absolute monarchy. And because they're actually driven by belief and they haven't just been conscripted, that makes them an incredibly effective army. You know, an army that's actually fighting for something rather than just because they have to will always win out over an army that's made up of conscripts who really don't want to be there and are looking for any opportunity to desert. And actually that's true to some extent to the infantry in the New Model Army as well, that some of them are much poorer people who also believe in the ideals of Parliament and they want to be there. And obviously being part of the war is a really radicalising experience. So what you have within the New Model Army is you have the most radical elements who are saying, well, actually, we could go further than the leadership of the parliamentarians are talking about. You know, actually, we shouldn't have limited suffrage for electing Parliament. Everyone should be able, well, every man should be able to elect Parliament. You know, so they're starting to talk about a much more radical vision of society, and they're starting to organise themselves and elect agitators to put forward their demands to the leadership. So it's becoming this kind of hotbed where the most radical ideas in society are being popularised and spread. So this is the rise of the Levellers, and I encourage everyone to talk to John Rees, who's sitting there in the corner, who is our Levellers expert. And I think he's got a book coming out hopefully very soon about this. So I'm hoping he's not going to sit there and go, oh no, you're wrong, as I talk about the Levellers. So this leads to what's called the Putney Debates in 1647. So next slide. So this is where the leadership of Parliament have to sit down and have a debate with the leaders of the Levellers about actually what they're saying about their radical ideas about how society should be organised. So this is, I think, one of the best quotations from the Putney Debates, a guy called Colonel Rainbow, who said, "For really I think that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he." So, you know, this isn't, he's not Lenin. This isn't full sort of proletarian revolution that he's arguing for here, but that's pretty radical. This is pretty impressive, I think, for the 17th century. And this shows you, these are the ideas that are driving. This is the driving force behind the English Civil War. It's not the bourgeois concerns. It's these concerns from people who are much lower down in society. And this is true also in the French Revolution. So next slide. So this is storming of the Bastille in 1789. And that was the poor of Paris. The leaders of the Third Estate, the guys who said no to the king when he asked them for more taxes, they're at this point sitting in a tennis court in Versailles going, "We will not be moved," which is cool, but it's the poorest people who storm the royal prison. The destruction of noble power in the countryside that I talked about, that's peasants. These are the people who are the lowest down in society, and they're the people who are driving events and actually making the fundamental difference. And you're always, at every point in the French Revolution, it's the poorest people who are called the sans-culottes, which I always used to think meant that they was too poor to have trousers, but it doesn't. It means that they wear trousers, not breeches, because if you're an aristocrat or if you're rich, you wear breeches. And if you don't, you wear trousers, because I suppose they're easier to make, I guess. So the sans-culottes are always, they usually agree with the Jacobins, but they're also a pressure on the Jacobins from below, making sure that they're radical. They're a force that can be used to oppose counter-revolution, but they're always making sure don't backslide, carry on being radical. It's a pressure from below that drives events. And even when the Jacobins are overthrown, actually, you have considerable sans-culotte rebellions in 1795, for example, when the revolution is kind of being defeated. And so it's always actually those grievances at the bottom of society that are driving what happens in the French Revolution. And it's worth noting here, actually, that they have a lot to have grievances about. As I said, in France, before the revolution, only the Third Estate pays taxes, which obviously includes rich merchants and so on. But it actually means that if you're a peasant, you have a horrendous tax burden. Some academics who work on sort of the peasantry in the 17th century calculated that if you're a 17th century French peasant, you're probably being expected to pay actually at least 20% of your income to just in royal taxes. And then on top of that, you have to pay seigneurial taxes to your lord, and you have to pay tithes to the church. So considering that these are not very rich people to start with, that is an enormous burden. And that's hugely resented, because it is that they are actually living in real poverty. And there's also a tax called the gabelle, which is worth knowing about because it's completely iniquitous. The gabelle is a tax on salt. It started at the end of the Middle Ages by the French king. So, if you buy salt from the royal factor, you have to pay tax on it. But then, French peasants being enterprising types, they think, right, okay, well, because of the way that France's history, which I won't go into, you have different levels of the gabelle in different areas. And in one area in Aquitaine, where they just had a massive rebellion against its imposition, there's no gabelle at all. So, of course, if you live in an area bordering on Aquitaine, you think, right, well, we're not going to buy the salt in our area where we have to pay royal taxes on it. We'll just nip over the border and buy the untaxed salt. So the kings noticed that actually their revenues for the gabelle go down because everyone's avoiding it, because there's lots of salt smuggling. So they then impose a law that says that you have to buy a certain amount of salt. So it's basically as if the government said, right, we're going to put like 50% VAT on bread, and everybody has to buy 5 loaves a week from the government shop. It's it's completely iniquitous and hated tax, the gabelle. And it's resentment against stuff like that which is really driving the growth of the radicalism that's really the motoring force behind the French Revolution. So just next slide. So this is just a summary of the condition that the French peasantry were in. John Locke, who you may have heard of as an English philosopher, he did a sort of tour of France in the 17th century, and this is what he found. He said the French peasantry in the 17th century were a rank of people under much heavier pressure of want than the day labourers in England. And he went on to talk about how day labourers in England, had clothes and they wore shoes and they could have meat sometimes, whereas basically the French peasantry were half naked and starving. So this is where the motoring force for the revolution comes from. So the next point that I think we need to remember about the bourgeois revolutions is that after a certain point, the bourgeoisie always turn on the forces from below that are the driving force in the revolution. Basically, because it gets out of hand and they think, right, we've overthrown the absolute regime, we've got rid of the monarchy, this is great, but actually the radicalism that this has stirred up has not gone away, in fact it's getting worse and we're going to be next. So basically what they identify is the logic of permanent revolution, which is that, yeah, they will be next. So they have to turn on those below them to make sure that doesn't happen. So Cromwell, actually quite unwillingly, because he was quite sympathetic in many ways to the levellers, as I understand it, actually did turn on the levellers in the end. He put the leaders in the Tower in 1649, put down the mutiny, which included shooting some of them in Burford, and the rest of the New Model Army was sent off to Ireland to oppress and murder Irish peasants. Okay, that gets rid of that radicalism. And next slide. So in the American Revolution, after the British have been expelled in 1786, you have a rebellion led by a guy called Shea, which is again kind of a continuation of the radical forces that were behind the American Revolution, and that was put down with great violence. And this is Samuel Adams said, in a monarchy, the crime of treason may admit of being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the laws of the Republic ought to suffer death. And I think sort of the strength of that is because he is so scared of actually really radical revolution that might overthrow the bourgeois revolution in its turn. So, okay, no, we're not going to put up with this, we're going to execute them all. And that's indeed what happened. And in 1795, also in the French Revolution, the sans-culotte risings against sort of the counter-revolutionary forces were put down with extreme viciousness, again because of that fear that, okay, you've stirred up this radicalism, now you've got to deal with it. And this actually is a pattern that's quite an old one. So if you look in the period before the bourgeois revolutions that we're talking about, say in the 16th century, there's quite a few sort of proto-bourgeois revolutions, if you like say the German Peasants War, which is when you have the Anabaptists in Munster, you might have heard of. There's that Italian anarchist novel Q, which was a big deal a few years ago, which is about that. It's very good, actually, I recommend it. But that rebellion stirred up all this radicalism, and actually the bourgeois forces that were behind that then allied with their previous enemies, who were the aristocrats, to put down the radicals, because they were so scared of what they'd unleashed that actually they thought, well, we'll forgo our aims. We've just got to get rid of these rebels. Okay, so I've obviously taken far too long to get to that point. The last point that I wanted to make is that the revolutions that we're talking about here aren't isolated events. We have to see them in the context of the shape of class struggle actually throughout the Middle Ages. We can't, if we think that really nothing happened and then in the 17th century it all gets interesting, we're not really understanding the dynamic of revolution. So the important point that I want to make is that there always is class struggle. In Western Europe, you can see actually going back right to the end of the Roman Empire, in fact, to Spartacus, who people might have heard of, that's a class rebellion. And there are peasant rebellions consistently throughout the Middle Ages. But basically there's a change in the shape of what the revolutions are like. Up until about the 14th century, peasant rebellions are about overthrowing unjust authority and then going home and living in your village, which you've now freed from people sitting on top of you exploiting you. It's basically looking back to effectively a kind of a communal way of life which existed since the Neolithic. And in about the 14th century, people start realising that actually society has become too complex. You can't just aim to go back and live in your free village and not actually worry about society or anybody else. Actually, they start recognising that you do have to have a state. So, next slide. So this is the Peasants Revolt in 1381. This is one of the first rebellions in Europe that recognises that actually you can't just overthrow the king and then go home. So they are actually wanting to set up a state. They think they'll keep the king, but he'll rule for them because he'll be under their control. And they say, right, we'll overthrow the whole organisation of the church and we'll have one bishop, which will be John Ball, who was a priest who was one of the leaders of the rebellion. So, they weren't necessarily thinking very sophisticatedly, but they were thinking of actually, we're not just getting rid of exploitation and going home, we're actually having a new state. So this is John Ball, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman. So that's questioning how society's run, but it's not just saying, okay, well, never mind about that. It's thinking about, well, we actually have to make a different society. And there's also another rebellion about the same time in Florence called the Rebellion of the Ciompi, which actually takes over Florence and runs Florence for a couple of months in 1378. And that's actually taken over by some of the poorest people, there's weavers and people like that. And that, again, it's kind of, it's thinking about actually we have to take control of the state rather than just go home and live in independent communes. So this is actually, I think, sort of the roots of the bourgeois revolution. And actually what happens from the end of the Middle Ages through the early modern period is that continues. You don't necessarily recognise that that's continuing, because what you learn about in school, what happens in the 16th century, the 17th century, is you learn about the Reformation, the growth of Protestantism, and then Catholic, conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, and you kind of think, because mainstream historians tell us, oh hey, that's just about religion, that's not about anything else. Well, actually, that's class conflict. That is the development of bourgeois revolution, is the Reformation. Protestantism is really identified with actually social revolution. It's identified with the emerging bourgeoisie. And the logic of what Protestants say in terms of religion is actually really, really threatening to the existing regimes. If you think about, for example, what Calvinists say, they say that, okay, you have the elect and the damned, and it doesn't matter what you do, you just either are elect or you are damned. And the thing with that is that's really, really threatening, because it's very difficult to rule a population who are Calvinists if you're a king, and they're all sitting there thinking, well, we're the elect, and you know what, king, I bet you're the damned. This kind of destroys your royal authority. It's actually very challenging. And kind of things about Protestantism, it puts the emphasis on reading the Bible in your own language, or kind of thinking, studying the Bible, understanding it yourself. It's very anti-hierarchical, actually. So I'm trying to gallop through this quite quickly, but next slide. this is it's just a show of the monstrous beard. Those of you who've got beards in the audience, this is what you should be aiming at. This is John Knox, who's a Protestant leader in Scotland. And actually, if you want to look at the dynamic of Protestants versus Catholics and how actually that's revolutionary, you should look at John Knox and Mary Queen of Scots, because that is actually the growth of the Bourgeois Revolution in a very small place. It's quite easy to see the dynamic. And what you get, therefore, in response to the rise of Protestantism is actually Counter-Reformation, which is also the growth of absolute power. So by the 17th century, you have the growth of royal absolutism. And next slide. You have guys like Louis XIV, who famously said, "L'État c'est moi," the state, it's me. So there's no other authority, there's no other structures, it's just the king. And this is his impressive Palace of Versailles. You can tell that this guy, the guy who built this, is not a constitutional monarch. You know, this is a real sort of restatement of royal power. And this is actually where the bourgeois revolutions that we've talked about come from. They're reactions to absolutism, which is itself a reaction to the pressures of Protestantism and so on. So this is a dialectic, basically. And this is the dialectic that lasts for the entire of the late medieval, early modern period. So we can't really understand the bourgeois revolutions if we think of them as something that really only started in the 17th century. We have to understand them as a dynamic that really goes back to the Peasants Revolt. So, last slide. So I just wanted to leave you really with one of my favourite images. This is Wat Tyler and John Ball at Mile End challenging the king in the Peasants Revolt. So I think where I'm taking issue with the title I was given is that the first revolutions don't start with the English Civil War. They start here at Mile End in 1381. Thank you.
Thank you for that. In no particular order, I suppose the last point first about the New Model Army. Yeah, I mean, sorry, this is the problem of having to gallop through several hundred years of history. Yeah, I mean, obviously there is conscription into the New Model Army. They're not all volunteers, and that's particularly true, I believe, of the infantry. But I think the core of particularly the cavalry in the New Model Army is people who want to be there, who believe in it ideologically, and that's what makes a difference. That's why they do better than any other army. That's why they're such a formidable fighting force. So I think that's the point to stress. Although you are correct that they're not all volunteers. The point about Charles I. I mean, you're absolutely right that this is the victory of finance capital, if you like, of the bourgeoisie, and it's true. It's been true in England for quite a long time that the Parliament actually represents people who are richer than the king, and that's why kings have to keep calling parliaments, because they want to get money out of them. They've got all this money. They're beginning to develop all this international trade, and so on. And the king needs some of that, so he has to try and get it. I mean, I think Charles I is not necessarily the world's most effective or successful absolute monarch, but he is trying to be an absolute monarch. And he's actually trying, in a sense, to create absolute monarchy, because the Tudors aren't. I mean, well, the Tudors are also trying, but they haven't really succeeded either. And Elizabeth has a very long reign where she has to try and balance all of these forces, so she can't start strutting around like Louis XIV. And Charles I is trying to and not managing it very well. So there is that strain, but I think a lot of what actually is the proximal causes of the English Civil War is reaction to Charles's attempts to be absolutist, I think. But you're absolutely right. It is the victory of the people with the money. That's very true. That's what bourgeois revolution is, really. A point about the noble families, and I think this is interesting because you're absolutely right that in America, it is the noble families who continue being wealthy, but they don't continue being, they don't continue being powerful because they're feudal aristocrats. They continue being powerful because they manage to become successful bourgeois. So and that's true in England as well. That if you look at people like Duke of Westminster still owns large parts of London, is incredibly wealthy. He is an aristocrat, but that's an aristocratic family who managed then to get into to become bourgeois. So they are part of the bourgeoisie in that sense. They're not. He doesn't have money because he still has people paying him feudal dues. He doesn't have people who are doing their feudal service on his lands for twice a month or whatever. That's not the basis of his power. So I think what one can sometimes, and mainstream historians do this, they get kind of confused when you see the same surnames
or when in fact you see different surnames and they start thinking, oh, right, the whole aristocracy has been destroyed, which is a thing that medieval historians do. And actually it doesn't matter what people's names are, it matters structurally where they're getting their power from. And that is what the revolutions change. So, I mean, Chris's point about earlier bourgeois revolutions, I did have to cut a whole bit, which was going to be absolutely brilliant, about the about the Dutch Revolt because of reasons of time. I mean, the Dutch Revolt really is the first bourgeois revolution. So the Dutch are ruled from by the Habsburg Emperor, and they overthrow that after a very long war, and that really is led by sort of merchants basically in what's now Holland, and that's actually very successful. I think the thing is that I know some historians argue this, that you don't get the full development of capitalism until you have sort of regimes imposing it from above. So like the argument about Bismarck, that's the imposition of capitalism in Germany. And so therefore that's a revolution from above because it's imposed, but unification's imposed. I don't buy that. I don't think you can argue that Germany isn't capitalist until Bismarck. I think, you can see actually in Germany you've had sort of successive bourgeois revolutions since the German Peasants War, which is in the 1520s. I think Germany has got capitalism by the 19th century. So I don't buy this argument that actually Germany has to develop towards capitalism because of a revolution from above in the 19th century. I don't think that that's what happens. And you have to see the development of capitalism is a relational process. It's not something that happens in one moment. And actually, in many ways, the seizing of power by the bourgeoisie is kind of the final element in the development of capitalism. It's not where capitalism starts, I think I would say. I'm not qualified to answer the point about Japan because I know absolutely nothing about Japan. I hope maybe someone here will be able to respond. Yeah, I mean the point about the sort of financial bubble being sort of the important for the French Revolution. I mean, I think James kind of answered that, but just to sort of reiterate, I mean, I think that is clearly a proximate cause, but obviously there's much more deep-seated issues in French society, which are kind of the more important causes in a sense. But yeah, it's true that actually kind of, in sort of early capitalist development, you have these things. As James mentioned, the South Sea Bubble, there's also the Darien thing, which basically bankrupts the Scottish government. This is happening actually, in this kind of early form of capitalism. Actually, this happens quite often. I think this isn't a particularly unusual event, and clearly it does cause kind of strains, and it is a proximate cause of the French Revolution. But I think you need to recognise actually that there is a long history here. I mean, weirdly, the 18th century in France is much less rebellious than the 17th, and there's kind of a weird lull in sort of peasant rebellions in the years leading up to the French Revolution. So you could kind of start thinking as, it's a bit like volcanoes or something. It's like when they've been dormant for a while, that's when you're in for a really big eruption. But in the 17th century in France, there's actually over 1,000 peasant rebellions, and the causes of those rebellions have not gone away, and that's really what's underlying the revolution, I think. Having said that, I know nothing about Japan. I do want to say something, not so much about Japan specifically, but about how we think about it and how Japanese society relates to or is similar to Europe. Because obviously this is often said that Japan is a feudal system, so you do talk about Japan in these sorts of contexts. And I think it's true that Japanese society looks quite feudal. So in a sense, it makes sense to use that term when you're thinking about it to an extent. But the point I want to make is that it's not like you have these kind of ideal systems that are then kind of put onto a society and then they run in the same way because someone's told them, right, you're a feudal society now. These grow up historically. So European feudalism looks like it does and has the facets that it does and works in that way because of how it grows historically out of the end of the Roman Empire and what happens in Europe in the Dark Ages. So it's a historical system. And capitalism grows out of feudalism in Europe specifically, and it has the features that it does because it grows out of the historical system that was in Europe before. That is different in Japan. The system that looks kind of feudal in Japan grows out of a completely different set of circumstances in Japanese history. So although it's quite useful in analysing how societies work to say, that looks like that works, it looks like that's a feudal society, that's an ancient state system, that only gets you so far. You have to look at the historical realities. And I think when you think about the development of capitalism in Japan, as James said, you have to look at actually, capitalism from when it starts in Europe, it then immediately has aspirations to be a global system. This is because that's the logic of capitalism, that it has to expand all the time. So it is a system that spreads itself around the world. And that then tells you actually that's then what influences the development of capitalism in Japan. So I suppose that's the point I want to make really, that actually I think you can't really understand the development of capitalism unless you understand how European feudalism works. But I think you have to remember that feudalism in Japan, it might look similar, but it's actually a really different system because of the historical realities that it grows out of. You know, I'm a medieval historian, so I'm all about people understanding the medieval context. So I think that's kind of the final message I want to leave you with.
Cool. Thank you, Elaine. We're going to start the next